Oh, thank you for the notification. So I'm glad he's taken the time to join us. And you're also welcome, of course, to join the Unity Reflections of Truth service after this one. So please give Reverend Julian a warm welcome. He's going to talk on Palm Sunday, a
Thank
donkey.
you. Thanks, Stuart, and thank you, Unity of Melbourne, for inviting me to speak this morning. I love coming down and being online and being able to talk to you guys. I have a very soft spot for Unity of Melbourne. In the early days of my being with Unity, I spent a bit of time down in Melbourne, hanging out with Reverend William and meeting Stuart and a few others, and of course the lovely Leslie. And I just love coming down to Melbourne when I ever get a chance. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak. So you would have seen and you would have kind of probably scratched your heads. I mean, you may not have scratched your heads, but, why is Palm Sunday a donkey story? And so it's really interesting about the donkey within this particular story and why Jesus specifically chose a donkey. Now, I'm not sure how much Bible study you folks have done, so I'm going to say some stuff, and if I'm saying stuff you've heard before, then please forgive me. But you may or may not be aware that the Bible is divided into the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures. And in the Hebrew scriptures were a whole bunch of prophets who prophesied a whole bunch of information. And then in the Christian Bible, they tried to quantify or at least marry up against some of those prophecies that were provided in the Hebrew Bible. And the donkey is one of the prophecies that was provided in the Hebrew Bible. And it was originally by a prophet, Zechariah, in a poem that he wrote, or it's written like a poem, basically. But it's Zechariah 9, verse 9, where he talks about a donkey. And it is then retold by Matthew in Matthew 21, from the verses 1 through to 11, where he actually quotes Zechariah, who said, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So it's kind of the arrival of Jesus into Jerusalem is kind of trying to match some of the stuff that occurred from the prophecies of the Hebrew Bible, because at the time Jerusalem and the whole of the Jewish nation were basically being controlled by the Romans. So the Romans were in charge, and they were managing and they were controlling everything. And one of the things about the Romans is that they didn't. They knew that they couldn't completely eradicate some of the Jewish holy days, the Jewish processes. So what they tried to do was they tried to take them over and also do things to kind of Romanize this process. So what you may not be aware of is that, and I'm sure, or I'm hoping that you know the story, but basically, if we read Matthew 21, Jesus is, reaching a place called Bethphage, which is at the Mount of Olives, and Jesus sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this: the Lord needs them, and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. So they did that. They went down and they got the donkey and they brought it back. Now, what's really interesting, something you may or may not know or be aware of, is that Jesus came in from one direction into Jerusalem, but Jerusalem had two major entrances to the city. The first was sort of more from the Jewish and the Judean aspect. The other entrance was predominantly the direct route coming in from Rome. And at the same time as Jesus was coming in on the donkey, Pontius Pilate was coming in the other side, almost at exactly the same time. So the aspect of one of the things that the prophet Zechariah said is that and this is kind of important to understand, but Zechariah was prophetizing that the king who was going to save the Jewish nation was going to arrive in Jerusalem. And in fact, the full part of the poem that he wrote goes, rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion, shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So it was really important that Jesus arrive on the donkey, because Jesus, and this sort of leads to why I'm saying it's a donkey story. Jesus knew, it's pretty strong evidence that Jesus knew what his next week was going to look like. We have all sorts of modern tools that allow us to determine what our week is going to look like. We've got Outlook, we've got Facebook, we've got all sorts of things that we can use. We can use, whiteboards and stuff like that. Jesus didn't have that. Jesus had his in-knowing understanding of the journey that he needed to take. But he knew that he didn't need to do it with a fanfare. He needed it to unfurl, and he needed it to occur in a way that people weren't expecting. And so coming in on the donkey was to meet the needs of one prophecy, but also he knew that Pontius Pilate would be arriving on the other side. And of course, Pontius Pilate his arrival was full of pomp and ceremony. He had a huge procession of cavalry. He had soldiers, because his position in that area was that he was the governor of Idumea and Judea and Samaria. So he was a big man. He had a big job, and he was a very important person. So he needed to show his importance by the pomp and ceremony of which he was arriving in Jerusalem. It's interesting. An interesting side note is that when you look at pictograms of the Roman Empire, if you see somebody and they're riding a chariot and they have 12 horses, usually 12 horses, that's the king. The next group down usually has 6 horses. The next group down has 4 horses, and then of which Pontius Pilate did, because he was a governor of 3 areas. So he arrived on a chariot being pulled by 4 stallions, and it's a sign of who they are and their importance in the government was the number of horses pulling the chariot. So it's interesting that he came in with a horse-drawn chariot bringing 4 horses, whereas Jesus came in riding the colt of a donkey, not even the donkey. He was riding a colt of a donkey. One way to look at that is that Jesus is actually, his entry is proclaiming the kingdom of God, whereas Pilate is claiming the power of empire, which is a very different way to look at the 2 entrances. For those of you that have done some more study on Bible studies might have heard of Marcus Borg, who was a great writer about some of the biblical texts, and he's a wonderful writer. If you haven't read any of his work, please do so. But he worked with a gentleman by the name of John Dominic Crossan, and they wrote a book called The Last Week. And the entire book is dedicated to the last week of Jesus. And they state, Pilate's procession displayed not only imperial power, but also Roman imperial theology. According to this theology, the emperor was not simply the ruler of Rome, but the Son of God. At the time, Jerusalem, the city of God under King David, was the centre of what is known as the domination system of government, which is 1, political oppression, 2, economic exploitation, and 3, religious legitimization. God, I can't get that word out, but you know what I'm trying to say. The other thing about these two entrances, which is really important to understand, is that they actually embody the central conflict of the entire week. And that's really important to understand. So when we look at these two aspects of their arrival, when we look at Jesus, obviously metaphysically we look at things like the kingdom of God, the Christ consciousness, the kingdom of heaven, those sorts of teachings that he gave us. But when we look at Pontius Pilate, metaphysically, Pilate is the ruling principle of the sense plane, commonly known as the carnal will. So it's the human aspect of who we are, potentially from a very restrictive, controlled point of view. So I look at it for me, if I talk about myself, which I'm happy to do, when I look at it me, when I get really stuck on a specific human thought, feeling, or attitude without exploring the Christ consciousness, then I am in my Pilate phase. If I'm so mono-focused on this is what it's about, and I get, that's when you find, foot stomping and thumping of fists on desks. That's when I am very much in my Pilate stage. So Jesus arriving on a donkey, or the cult of a donkey, is an interesting thing to look at as well, because the donkey represents in the life and times of Jesus, at the time he was around, the donkey was a valuable tool used by pretty much everybody to achieve results. Okay, it was the functional part of being in the world at the time. It was used for transport. It was used for, carting carts and bringing goods and services to different cities. They didn't have a lot in the way of cattle and stuff, so sometimes donkeys were used to plough small fields, and the donkey was the workhorse. It was a necessary tool that was available to everybody to enable them to do their work and be able to do things. That's the same with us. Our humanness is a valuable tool we have to do what we need to do on a daily basis. Okay, so I'm not putting down the human side or the body side of who we are, but I'm just saying that it works at a lower vibration, and it is there for us to be able to go, oh, this is what I need to do each day. So I need to do the washing up, or I need to wash clothes, or I need to eat food, all of that sort of stuff. Without the body, I can't do that. So it's an important part of who we are. Whereas Christ sitting on top of the donkey we also have to recognize that the Christ consciousness is in charge of that vehicle that we have. And we have to operate from our Christ consciousness in every given moment, wherever we can. So it's important to understand that relationship between Christ and the donkey. The other aspect of this first day, because technically we're talking about the first couple of days, he actually arrives outside, comes down to Jerusalem, then he goes back out again, and then he comes back in. But this particular day, what we're talking about is, so what's so important about Jerusalem? Why is Jerusalem the place that he needs to be. So, a couple of things there. Jerusalem is the capital at the time, was the capital of Israel. So it was, it was the place to be. Originally, it was under King David, and King David created it, and it was the largest, it was the most powerful, and it was the safest place for people to live. It was also the home of the largest temple in the known world at that time. So it was a very important economic hub and also a very important religious hub. If you decide that you want to join Unity Reflections of this in the next service, Rhonda is talking about Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is known as the habitation of peace, and it represents that meeting place where sense consciousness meets the Christ consciousness, and this is where we also die to the old consciousness and rise to a new Christ consciousness. Okay, so Jerusalem is incredibly important to the story because of what it means, because it's a place of peace. What's really interesting is that the word Jerusalem, or the name Jerusalem, is made up of two words. The first one, Jerus, which means founding or constituting, so beginning. And the second half is actually, the second half of it is Salem, which means peace, quiet, safety, harmony, and prosperity. And at the time of Abraham, the place that is now known as Jerusalem was actually only known as Salem. So understanding that Jesus arriving on a donkey or on a colt of a donkey and heading into Jerusalem is he's choosing his higher plane, he's choosing his Christ consciousness to lead him to a place of peace. Now, we often attribute this, traditional faiths across the board, faiths believe that Jesus, that this last week was the most horrific because Jesus was killed and crucified in a very horrible way. And I'm assuming that you'll talk about that this week. But then it's also the resurrection happens afterwards, and that there's everlasting life from that perspective, and it has a very traditional sort of specific look at it. But Jesus was at peace the entire time throughout the entire process. The only time he got angry was he got angry at a fig tree because it wasn't producing figs. But the rest of the time he was in a state of peace, knowing the steps he needed to take, knowing where he was going and what was going to happen to him in the future. He was at peace with that. He was completely, the disciples went nuts, as we know, at the Last Supper, but he was very much at peace with what was going on. And that's why Jerusalem is known as the city of peace. The last thing I want to bring up about this whole process is why was Jesus going? I mean, we know about the crucifixion, we know about the trial and all that sort of stuff, but there was another reason that Jesus and Pontius Pilate were both arriving in Jerusalem at the same time. And this was to celebrate Passover. Now, Passover, some of you would, I'm assuming, would have heard what Passover is about or know a bit about Passover. But just in case, it's traditionally a specific event that tells the story when the Jewish people were first going out of Egypt. So you may remember the story that that the Jewish people put lamb's blood on the doors of all their houses in Egypt, and the plague came through and wiped out anybody who didn't have the blood. And it's called Passover, or the Jewish name for it is Pesach. The Pesach was God passed over those people who had put lamb's blood, sacred lamb's blood, on their doors. And that was the sort of the last straw for the Pharaoh of Egypt. And he said, that's it, go, get out of here. And, the famous line from Moses is, he went to the Pharaoh and said, let my people go, let it happen. But it was the last plague per se. And so from that time on, the Jewish nation remembered that time as Passover, the Passover service or Passover ceremony. And metaphysically, Egypt is that realm of substance and life in the depths of the body conscious. So again, we're coming back to understanding that there is a body conscious and there is a Christ conscious. And our body conscious is okay. It's not a bad thing. It's a good part of who we are. If we take our first premise at Unity, that there is only one power, one presence, and that presence is available everywhere, then it's in us and it's in our body, but it's also in our Christ consciousness, and we can access it from there. So when we look at Jesus coming into that Passover period and being a part of that Passover period, symbolically, what Jesus was trying to get people to understand, especially if we talk, in more depth about the crucifixion process, and then also the reincarnation or the bringing back of Jesus's spirit. Jesus wants people to release those negative, self-defeating parts of who we are and recognize that we have this Christ consciousness. He wants us to let go of the Egypt in us and recognize the kingdom of heaven within us. Now, both states are within us. We have beautiful free will, and we have the ability to choose what we want to, which direction we want to go in. So Jesus riding the colt into Jerusalem means the fulfillment of time when the spiritual I am within us takes control and lifts all the animal forces up to the spiritual plane of mastery, purity, and peace. When the I am takes charge of the body, a new order of things is inaugurated. The vitality is no longer wasted. Through high and pure ideals, the whole consciousness is raised to a higher standard. The hosannas of the rejoicing multitude and the spreading of their garments and branches and trees before Jesus represents joyful obedience and homage that all the thoughts in one's consciousness give when an error state of mind is overcome. Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Now, what I just read you was from Charles Fillmore. It's from the book Keep a True Lent. If you haven't done anything with Lent in the past, it's quite a worthwhile exercise to go through. But Charles said, it is that ability of us to be able to move beyond the human state but stay with it. So again, coming back to why is it the donkey story, the higher consciousness has to work with the lower consciousness. Now, higher and lower is words I don't prefer to use, but it gives you a picture. The Christ consciousness has to work with the human consciousness and vice versa. We have to have both in concert with each other to enable us to enter the state of Jerusalem, to enter that state of peace. If we're constantly fighting against those two, there is no peace. You are not in Jerusalem. And so that's the part of looking and understanding the spiritual journey that we are on. So what I'd like you to do now is take yourselves into a comfortable space of meditation. Allow yourself to breathe in, through, and as you. Breathe in the love and life of life. Breathe out any thoughts of negativity. Allow yourself to empty your mind of erroneous thoughts, feelings, attitudes. And I want you to visualize yourself yourself as that combination of both your Christ consciousness and your human consciousness. Feel that sense of self, knowing that you have human thoughts, human feelings, human understanding, but that you also have that Christ loving inner knowing. Allowing yourself that opportunity to experience both as one, that oneness of who you are. And see yourself as that combination. Entering into that state of Jerusalem, this powerful image of peace, love, harmony. And knowing that this state of being is always possible. And in your mind's eye, say to yourself, I love myself the way I am. The I am is the way I am. I love myself the way I am. The I am is the way I am. And we know this as the single truth of who I am. And for this, we have a grateful heart as we send that divine love out into the universe, loving every aspect of the I am that I am. And we know that this is done with the use of the word Amen. And so it is.